Good evening. Today is Tuesday, February 9th, 2021, and this is a special edition and the 38th episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. My guest today is a dear friend of mine, Michael Yon, who I know to be the most experienced living combat correspondent. The last time that Mike was on our show was on October 16, 2020, as we looked into the operations of groups like Antifa in the United States. Michael is a former Green Beret, native of Winter Haven, Florida, who has written from Iraq and also Afghanistan going back to December of 2004. No other writer has spent as much time with combat troops in these two wars, especially in this decade. Michael's dispatch from the front line earned him the reputation as a premier independent combat writer of his generation, our generation. His work has been featured on Good Morning America, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, CNN, ABC, Fox News, internationally on Japan Forward, the Thai PBS, and also he's a regular on John Batchelor show and has been a guest on Stephen Bannon War Room Pandemic, as well as hundreds of others major media outlets all around the world. Michael had previously written a critically acclaimed memoir, Danger Close, as early as February 2005. Michael described the violence that was taking place at that time in Iraq as a civil war. In 2006, we looked at losing the war in Afghanistan. 2007, he was the first writer to claim success in the surge. And when he first voiced these opinions, initially, they were extremely controversial. Now they have become part of the conventional wisdom of the time. And in 2008, Michael published his second book, Moment of Truth in Iraq, which is one of the major books that in May 2005, when he took a picture of the U.S. Army Major Mark Bejer, creating a young Iraqi girl named Farah, who was wounded by shrapnel from a car bomb. Major Mark Bejer tried to take that young lady to an American hospital to receive treatment, but she died on the helicopter ride. The photo itself, which is featured on the cover of the book Moment of Truth in Iraq, has been overwhelmingly attributed as a monumental photo that turned the tide against the insurgency at that time in Mosul. As he covered the two wars, Michael also focused on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, and China's expansion in Southeast Asia and its information operational campaigns against the United States and our regional and global allies as it bullied its way across the globe. Michael was the first to realize that China was not going to leave Hong Kong alone, regardless of the international pressures, and was on the ground after the second large protest that took place in late June of 2019. January 29, 2018, nearly 3 years to the day of the newest multi-coup in Burma, I had written an article for NEC-SE that was titled Ethnical Cleansing in Burma's Arakan region, the Chinese move in, and the force ethnic minorities out during a 17 to 23 January 2018 visit to northern and also southern Thailand. A portion of my trip in conducting the Near East Regional Strategic Assessment for Southeast Asia, which led to a white paper being presented to the National Security Council in January of 2018. I did look into the causes of the crisis that in 2017 had led to seeing over 65,000 people forced from their homes and also at least 6,000 killed. Michael joined me at a critical meeting with some of the key figures dealing with the Burmese genocide, and I found that the war crisis was not attributable, as it's been often said by the mainstream press, as they have also done in covering the most recent coup, as far as policies by the government of the now arrested Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, but rather to the Burmese army operations to ethnically cleanse Arakan of the Rohingyas and other non-Burmese minority groups. In the article, we looked at why General Halang, who's now head of the government, had taken such an interest in the Arakan region, a remote and impoverished region in the far west of the country. The answer lay in China and the CCP's ambitions to control the Straits of Malacca. Arakan is home to the largest Chinese expansionist project in the region, the Chinese government consortium known as CITIC, or the Chinese International Trust Investment Corporation. At that time was streamlining $14 billion project into the region, where it still is building a deep water port and oil transport and processing facility and other projects designed to take delivery of and from the Middle East and a pipeline directly to China. So Michael, it's good to have you back on the show again. And who would have thought that almost 3 years to the date of our meeting on the ground on the Burmese genocide, that we would have seen a coup d'etat by the same figures that were the drivers of the initial genocide in Burma. Before I do bring you in here, Mike, for us to discuss, I do want to make sure that our audience get to know exactly who you are, especially with the coverage that you had done for us on the ground for U.S. interests in Hong Kong.
Hello, Sargis.
So this is it. This is storming the castle.
Some drama's going on down here. We need oil. Look at the squeaking armor from the police. They don't have their masks.
Mike, as always, it's a pleasure to have you here, buddy. And you always tend to find yourself in some of the most critical areas of the world. And God bless you. Thank you for everything that you do for us.
Thanks, Sargis. I made all those videos that you just showed in Hong Kong, actually. Because I was in the fighting for about 7 months before they kicked me out in February of 2020. Of course, then we had the pandemic start to unfold and that sort of thing. And so I was going to head to Taiwan, actually, from Thailand. You know, I have an office in Thailand, so I was heading to Taiwan. And then the problems in the United States became more acute, and you can see what we have going on here now. And so what I'm gravely concerned with here is that the United States itself is drifting off into an actual civil war. We won't know for some, I mean, arguably it already is in a very low-level civil war. If it kicks off into something more kinetic, it'll almost certainly be in the spring and summer, as these things typically do kick off. And, you know, it's our first civil war, if you want to call it the first civil war, 1861 to 1865, kicked off in April. And, of course, our Revolutionary War in April. That's just normal, that these things kick off in spring and summer. I hope it does not. We'll see. But now, of course, we've got other issues with Burma. And, of course, you and I first met in Tokyo when we were both fighting CCP and still are. And so these are all, as you very well know, wrapped into the same thing.
Yeah.
You know, the fight against CCP takes us around the world.
Mike, I think a lot of people don't understand. China growing influence started because of our support for him. Look, I knew that when I was in the service as a young captain at the time, you know, I retired as a lieutenant colonel, but China could not even conduct airfield seizures, those type of operations that our Rangers do and our special forces. And they started conducting those type of operations going back to the Clinton years. And part of it was because of the type of technology we shared with them. And I tell folks, and I've told them even when I was running in for office here on Campaign Trail, that, you know, what we think we give to nations like China and others that is going to be helping him on a humanitarian effort level usually comes back and bites us. As an example, when we had decided to just give nothing more than diesel fuel to the North Koreans. The North Koreans picked up that diesel fuel. They use it to make synthetic drugs that they sold in Japan. They use that money to go to South America, buy the component pieces that they needed to make missile technologies, and then sell that through Iran for their capability and getting us to the negotiation tables. And all this is tied again to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And the link analysis does go deep to include what happened with the 2020 election and how China had a massive operation here through companies that are really beholden to Chinese conglomerates. And Burma is just one of those main pieces. That's why I'm proud that we were able to, me and you, sit on the table 3 years prior to the, really almost to the date of the coup, and say, hey, look at what's about to happen with China, and look where we are today.
Right. I recognize this photo when we were meeting with some of the ethnic groups who were operating in Burma. We won't say where this photo was taken, but yeah, it was very interesting. And I still am in contact with Baluch and Pashtun people as well from Pakistan and Afghanistan. And when you hear the problems that the Baluch people and the Pashtun people have, it mirrors the same problems that people like Rohingya and Karen people have in Myanmar, and also for Karen or Rohingya people, it spreads beyond just Myanmar. And so, but the problem set is similar. China comes in, they help install and then deal with the most corrupt people they can. One-stop shopping, very centrally located, often the central government, and which is what they're encouraging here in the United States as well. And then they cut everybody else out. That's why people like the Baluch people and Pashtun people in Afghanistan and Pakistan are so upset, because they're being cut out, right? So they can build the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, through their areas, and then they get no economic benefit from it. In fact, it'll then be used to militarily put them down. So it's another situation that the ethnic groups in Myanmar have. And the BRI is not just limited to what the Chinese are doing. Obviously, the Indians have their own little thing going that goes up around the area of Bangladesh, as you quite well know, and as some of the ethnic groups told you and me when we were together. And so, yeah, it's the same sort of game plan that's played out around the world.
Yeah, we kind of saw this coming, because even a couple of years after that, I remember when I was in Australia and I gave a white paper also to their shadow defense minister at the time. A couple of years after we had taken this photo, I think it might have been almost a year or two when I took this photo, or we took this photo and we had that meeting on what was happening with China. And we told the Australian government that, look, China is really starting to develop its mining capabilities at the detriment to Australia's future. And then that's where we also had our contactual meetings with our contact in Pakistan, which showed that pretty much everybody who was at that time in the Pakistan parliament was on the Chinese payroll for their companies. And unfortunately, we see that here in our government. And we do see China's influence in our Congress, especially with how they try to develop some of our congressional candidates, even with what you have seen with actual Chinese operators working for congressional candidates that are running and are not currently even congressmen in the U.S. Congress. And when people say, well, how is the foreign policy really affecting us here? Take a look at what happened with just the Dominion system, with how the Chinese companies developed some of the component systems that were used and what we use for our elections here. And take a look at the news reports that are coming out now, looking at Chinese information operations. Again, it goes back to what we see on the ground in Burma and what we see how it develops here specifically.
They don't even try to. The Chinese communists don't even try to hide that they nurture members of our high level of our government. In fact, they just do it openly. I mean, I think it just increases their status, actually, that they do this. Look at Biden. Clearly, is just completely contaminated by the Chinese Communist Party. It's not even vaguely hidden.
Look, we wrote an article. I wrote an article going back to 2015, and this was again after we had just come back from what was taking place in that briefing that we gave in Tokyo, and it was new power relations, and just looked at whether or not would Biden be able to accomplish Obama's foreign policy once he entered the race, and really going back now 5 years to their inauguration date almost, that we had looked at that. And why? Because for me and you who are on the ground and we see these things that are, with our own hands, touch, feel, talk to folks, we see the pattern. We're able to see how the network is developing. I mean, some of the stuff that guys like you see and are because of your experience. You've had enormous experience in combat. You've seen how insurgencies develop. You've seen what are the mechanisms used. People aren't gonna develop something new, a new way of approach. Technology might change, but the means and ways of getting to your end goal when it comes to these type of operations still haven't changed. Information operations really haven't changed. The Chinese are actually much more blunt, as you said, about them. For whatever reason, we have a hard time seeing him here in the U.S., and I'm not sure it's because maybe you just haven't had the experience that most others have had, guys like you on the ground.
Right. It's easy for us to spot because that's what we do. I mean, I've been watching CCP for years. I've written 3 books about it, for instance, that are all in Japan and in Japanese language, trying to wake up Japanese to the same problem. The problem set is enormous. They pollute Europe. They pollute across Asia. When I say pollute, I don't mean just toxic waste. They do that as well. But I'm talking about politically and through corruption, because corruption is their way of doing things. They're able to do things that would be illegal, for instance, for American business people to do. It's illegal for an American business person to bribe a member of a foreign government or a member of foreign business, for that matter. You can go to prison for that in the United States, but for China, that's just the way the government does business. They use their intelligence agencies to spy on American and other companies, Japanese as well. Of course, it's illegal for the CIA and FBI and others to spy on foreign companies and then provide that intelligence to American companies. That's illegal, right? But other countries, most other countries, don't play by rules like that. They use their national resources to spy for their whatever car companies. I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know where they send their intelligence to, but as you quite well know, it's just illegal in the United States to do this, but they throw billions of dollars into economic espionage.
Well, look, they do. I mean, especially when initially the so-called targeting was taking place against American servicemen that was described by the Russians in Afghanistan. I was able to point out the fact that, you had the Japanese companies that were moved out of the area with attacks against them. And we found out that the money came from China because China was trying to get into the mining industry there at the strategic level. So it was actually U.S. forces protecting the Chinese who were trying to mine the resources needed. And a lot of these resources, to include the ones that were able to use the COVID process to get into South America, is really tied to what U.S. is trying to push through as government when it comes to the Green New Deal. Because once you sign off and try to push the Green New Deal, which Biden is trying to do under the executive order, what you have done basically is you are now beholden again to Chinese companies that have moved into these areas and controlling the vast mineral capabilities that are needed. And when we try to develop some of those same mineral requirements that we have in our country and in the United States, including Texas, they use the money that they push through their connections to these environmental groups that are standing up and blocking the U.S. from trying to develop their own mining ability. Take a look at what under the current administration they have done. Again, we go back to the Paris Climate Accord deal, where we take majority of the hit as China taking over basically Burma, taking the Strait of Malacca and pushing its oil directly from the Middle East to its coal power plants to develop coal resources to sustain itself and make itself an economic independent capability, as we are banning even the use of our own abilities here to develop our own resources.
Right, and the Green New Deal. I mean, this is an economic trap. It's a tar pit for the United States. It's and any other Western companies that are stupid enough to go into this and weak. It takes extreme intellectual and moral weakness to just walk right into this ambush. Either that, or people are being paid off, or something along those lines. Because this is obviously a trap. It is so obviously a trap. It's almost embarrassing to have to explain it. And of course, when you try to explain this to people, they'll just say, follow the science. This is coming from people that probably never took an algebra class, much less a calculus class, and they don't know a proton from a neutron, right? So they'll say, follow the science. What science, right? It's just, it's really like brainwashing monkeys almost. Everybody's got to go get some Green New Deal, some Green New Bananas. It's a trap. It's an utter trap. China will never, abide by any agreement. They never do. They never will. That is not their nature. This is the law of the jungle. That's the only law they play by, is power. That's the only thing they understand. If you're weaker than they are, then they don't look to you as an equal, and they don't look at you in a humanitarian light. They look at you as like a cow that is to be exploited, right? They look at you as a chicken who is to be served on a plate, right? This is CCP. We're talking about communists. They're unbelievable. There is nothing that they will not do, and they've proven that over and over. Antifa is constantly talking about Nazis who took their fair share of genocide, horrific genocide, but there was nothing compared to what the communists have done. Nothing compared to what the Chinese communists have done specifically. And so that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a monster that does not play by any rules whatsoever.
No, it doesn't. And unfortunately, I think sometimes we also support them, subsidize them because they have lobby group capability. Take a look at the COVID bill. Americans are dying. There's folks that are still waiting in line to try to get at least a COVID shot. And the problem you have right now is that, in that COVID bill, you got money that are going to Pakistan, as you had mentioned, and also Burma. Now, first of all, my question would be, who was the person who pushed for that money to be sent to Burma or Pakistan? And why is that money going there? And now that we know that CCP is behind the the new Burmese coup, with General Halang being one of the individuals who was on their payroll to begin with, are we still going to send that money? And unfortunately, the way Congress works, once they've authorized something, they're not going to go back and change it. So you're going to be subsidizing Chinese Communist Party operations in Burma on behest of their lobby capabilities here in the United States. So I hope my question would be, who in the U.S. Congress pushed for this? Which lobby groups push for these monies to go to China, possibly subsidizing Chinese operations in both Pakistan and Burma? And once you take over these particular areas, the next place for us, which is very important where you actually operate, is Thailand, because a lot of the refugees will be pushed in there, and Chinese capabilities are really strengthening, as you know yourself, specifically even in Thailand, to include where Chinese cartoons are raising the next generation of Thai and also other Southeast Asian communities.
Right. This is a very difficult situation for the United States now. I mean, I'm in Los Angeles right now. Of course, I returned to the United States in September of 2019. I spent more than half of my life in other countries. Not half of my adult life, but more than half of my life in a total of 75 countries. United States and 74 others, right? I've been all over this country many times, and since September, I've been where, I don't know, a third of the states already, right? I've been in Washington, D.C. I was there when the Capitol attack happened. I was in Atlanta during protests, Portland during Antifa attacks, Washington State, you know, Florida, it goes on and on and on. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. I've been really seeing this thing. We've got people living homeless right outside this window, like 40 meters from me right now. Thousands of people living homeless in Los Angeles, and yet we're sending billions of dollars overseas. Now, many of these homeless are clearly homeless because you can see them clearly mentally ill, talking to themselves, screaming to themselves while they walk down the roads. Others clearly are drug addicts, and many that are probably something in between. Meanwhile, we've got billions of dollars to send to countries, many of whom really hate our guts, and at the same time, we've got growing problems there. We've got police being laid off due to budget problems while crime just soars. It's as if these policies were made in a basement by CCP. And then, you know, they've got their hands up the backsides of people like Biden. I know you don't like to get too political, but I mean, the fact is, let's call it what it is. You can't, a lot of people, when I do my war correspondent work, they say, you know, they loved it when I talked about only combat, because, you know, I do a lot of combat, or I used to. Haven't done much lately. Well, Hong Kong. Well, I guess I have. I've seen a lot. I guess I have seen a lot in the last, but it's been more riots, that sort of thing, not firefights. But you can't separate this from politics. It's like trying to talk about the human body without talking about the brain, you know, or without talking about behaviors and the nervous system. It's like, well, let's just talk about the muscles. Let's don't talk about the blood flow and everything else. I mean, you can't get a full picture without talking about the politics, period. And the politics of why we've got so many homeless people, you know, growing all over the United States, everywhere I go. I mean, you know, up in Portland, they're everywhere. You should see Portland now. I mean, and I was just out in Slab City over in Southern California. You ever heard of Slab City? It's unbelievable. And that's been going on for years, actually. But now this Slab City thing is growing all over the place. I've seen this out in Hawaii, tens of thousands of homeless in Hawaii. The jungles are filled with homeless in Hawaii. You can go up in Oahu, you know, and go up in the jungles there near Honolulu and near the Punch Bowl up in those jungles, which I've done. And it's just homeless people all over the place, you know, living on park benches, filling up the libraries and that sort of thing. You can't sit down here with anywhere without numerous people coming up to beg while you're having lunch. Of course, you can't eat lunch inside because of the CCP virus pandemic. And then if you eat lunch outside, you know, in the period of 30 minutes, 2 or 3 people are going to come up and really be right in your face, no mask on, spitting everywhere. And meanwhile, we're sending billions of dollars overseas. This just doesn't make sense in any rational framework.
Well, for you and me, it doesn't, because we think rationally on these issues. But the politician just cares about one thing: getting reelected, and they don't really care. I'll be honest about what the consequences will be, or maybe they're not able to see it. Now, I know that January 6th, you did cover what was happening on Capitol Hill. Let me ask you a question. Where is China's effects, from your perspective, on what happened on that day? I know that there's a lot of more information coming out. Even some of the newspapers that never even covered it, to include New York Times, has started looking seriously at what is happening. And then, again, it ties back to what we saw with the election fraud that took place in the Korean election. When I was in December of 2019, I was on the ground in Korea. We were looking at that assessment. And then we saw what happened in Ukraine. We've seen what has happened here, and what the court cases are still open. Nothing will change with the court cases, but at least I will go through a final, calculation. What was China's real role when it came to operations here that would have affected us at the national levels, especially with what happened on the 6th, and also elections and going forward?
Did you mention that New York Times is actually getting serious about covering what happened at the Capitol? That would be a shocker, actually. And actually, they called me up just before that. It must have been the day or 2 days before that maybe January 4th, I was in Washington and I talked with a reporter at New York Times. They were looking, the reporter's name, I've forgotten her name, but she said that that some people were sending their war correspondents to Washington, D.C. And they didn't quote me at all. Of course, I'm only the most experienced war correspondent alive in America. And they didn't quote me at all. There's like nobody that comes close to my level except Chuck Holton, And yeah, so
I know Chuck. Chuck is yes.
Yeah, Chuck Holton's got a lot of experience. And I was just with Chuck in D.C. I was just with Chuck over in Texas and also in New Mexico, and we went into Mexico together a couple times. Chuck's got, but they're not quoting people like Chuck and me who actually go out there and do this all over the world. They're quoting people who dip their toe into a little conflict here and there, and and they get the stories that they want. But the bottom line is, when it comes to people like Washington Post, they are corporations that are owned by other corporations, and they accept advertising. They're not media per se. They are information operations. When you change your paradigm of how you look, for instance, at CCP, if you look at CCP as a media organization, you'll be perpetually angry and flummoxed on why they're reporting it the way they do, because the paradigm is wrong. When you look at them as a media corporation, nothing makes sense except that there's something wrong with them, right? But when you just change your paradigm to a more accurate paradigm, that they are simply a for-hire information operation, then everything makes sense. I mean, whoever's got the big bucks will get CNN. You can buy CNN, you can fire out whoever's currently there and replace them with whomever you want, right? I mean, that's how these things work. If you've got the money and you're willing to put the money into it, you can buy Washington Post, you can buy New York Times. This is nothing, you can buy IBM if you've got the money. I mean, it's just a matter of people that can monetize things like this are big people like countries, massive corporations, like Amazon, things like that. These people can afford their own media. And if you're a huge corporation or a country like China who's growing and has literally hundreds of billions of dollars that are discretionary at a minimum, it makes perfect sense. You can monetize influence with major media around the world, because they're not media, they're just information brokers. They're nothing more than print houses. You and I can start a newspaper tomorrow. I mean, all we need is a printing press, right? That's it. That's all you need. It just changed the paradigm. There are real journalists out there. Mostly, they do not work for any of these corporations.
No, you can't. It's difficult. Even when the corporations look. I've dealt with newspaper editors who have wanted me to write for various different newspapers. Even when I looked at the coronavirus, February of last year, had put an article together, and they couldn't get it past the editors because they were just having so much hard time with the conglomerate leadership. Finally, at least the paper that I was locally here trying to give that article to said, we just can't do it. But you have your permission to take it somewhere else. And I ended up writing it for Japan Forward just because before Japan had to go under the lockdown, showing where the COVID virus originated from. And tell you what, finally was published in April rather than in February in a foreign newspaper. But just weeks after that, everything came out of the State Department. There's nothing that we are talking about here, Mike, so our audience know that has not been covered by even the newspapers now. We just looked at it 3 to 5 years prior to anybody else covering it. And we would have liked to have seen, especially with the white paper being given to the National Security Council, that they would have taken it seriously and see what has to happen, especially with China's information operation expanding. Mike, I know that we're short on time, and we could sit here and talk for hours, but where do you see us? What is the answer? What is the fix? Are we not going to be able to wean ourselves off of China's information operations? Do you think that these Americans who work for these major media outlets are going to at least see that we are in crisis as far as the U.S. is concerned, even under the current administration, that they had supported the money to come in, or are we just going to be heading down that road where China's on top of the hill? They haven't secured it yet, but it seems like they're going to be securing it over the next 4 years.
We're heading that way. I mean, their boy is in office now. Biden, he's clearly, something's wrong with him. We can all see that. People that can't see that now, I have no time for them. At this point, if they can't see that Biden is not firing on all cylinders, I just have no time for them, because they're not up to the level of a human that you would want to spend time with and try to persuade, to look at this situation. And Harris, how many electoral votes does she get, right? This is an installation of people that should not be anywhere near the White House. And by saying this, I'm not saying that Trump was some perfect guy either. I'm saying that we have a serious enemy on our hands, and that is the CCP. That is a very proximate threat. It's growing. We've got many other threats, for instance, the economy. This pandemic in and of itself, keep in mind, I masked up on January 11th or 12th of 2020. No. So I was masked up before most people even knew there was a pandemic, right? So I took this pandemic quite seriously. And it is a pandemic, but it's not the yellow fever. It's not smallpox. The reaction to the pandemic is devastating. It's not the pandemic, this relatively mild pandemic is polio was much worse than this. I've read more than 40 books on pandemic and several on polio. Polio was much worse than this, and polio wasn't, on the scale of pandemics, polio was not that severe. Polio just scares people because children get it, and people end up in iron lungs, which is a very scary thing, But when you look at, really severe pandemics, now we're talking about things like cholera, cholera has been serious at times, but we're talking more like, measles, smallpox, yellow fever. There are other ones which are Spanish flu, of course. Everybody should read at least 5 books on pandemic. I'm not going to recommend which books to read but I would read at least one on Spanish flu. I would read at least 1 book on yellow fever. I would read one on cholera, and I would read at least 1 book on mosquitoes. It's important to read 1 book on mosquitoes, because if you study mosquitoes, then you're touching on many different, whether it's encephalitis or yellow fever, malaria. Malaria is very serious. You can hit many at once. But it's interesting how many people go, oh, we've never seen anything like this in history. And I'm like, I don't know what planet you live on, but what about HIV/AIDS? How many has that killed? Nobody knows. 40 million, let's put a directional number out there. I mean, there's pandemics are always going on. There's many, many pandemics and epidemics always going on, but most are kind of below the radar because they're not that serious. But they're always out there, and HIV/AIDS is obviously quite serious. But we've learned to live with it. An interesting aspect is that we are going to always face pandemic. And when it comes to medicine, believe it or not, mankind is still very primitive. We still don't even know a lot about human nutrition. It's amazing how little we still know about nutrition. And that's super basic, right? And so that's quite interesting when we don't even know why, for instance, the Spanish flu, we don't even know why. The virologists don't understand why that pandemic just faded out, right? And by the way, it didn't just fade out in 1918 or 1919 or 1920. It kind of rippled on until the 50s, right? And then, it just kind of slowly regression to mean, kind of disappeared. But we still don't know why. Even the experts don't know why. And so this idea, for instance, when it comes to this vaccine, I've read so many books on pandemic and hundreds of articles over the years. As a war correspondent, you must study pandemic and famine. If you don't study pandemic and famine, you are not studying war. You have to study that triangle. It's the triangle of death. Pandemic, famine, and war. They go together. If you get a big war, you will always get a pandemic. You will always get a famine every single time. It's like if you get a big pandemic, you're going to get war and famine every single time. Same with famine. One of these, you get the other two. It's the Three Musketeers, and then you'll get human migrations. So square it out. You'll get big human migrations due to economic changes or people running from the yellow fever or whatever, right? But it's a very predictable, right? And that's why you saw me back last. If you watched my live feeds from Hong Kong for 7 months, there would be Molotov cocktails being flown, and I was out there live streaming and taking a break and saying, you know, what's the latest on the swine flu or the avian flu or the army worms over in China, right? So you would, many times during 2019, I would start talking about avian flu or something. And not because I'm paranoid, I'm just cautious, like I am with, you know, tsunami, right? And so, you know, obviously I'm not a easily scarable person. I do so much real combat where real people are getting killed around me all the time. But
no, I don't think you're a scarable person, Mike. Yes.
But I pay very close attention to bullets. I pay very close attention to.
Yes, you have to.
I got a bunch of vaccines to get, you know, to go back to India in 2019. I was preparing to go back to India for research, and you know, I've spent 10 months in India, which is like 500 years in any other country. I mean, 10 months in India is a pretty severe experience. You know, I put that up there with war. You know, and so I was getting ready to go back to India, and I was getting all these vaccines, and then kicked off in Hong Kong, and I went to Hong Kong. So I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I preface all this to say I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I get vaccines, and I do them when I'm not told to, right? Because I've seen so much disease out there, like in India and Bangladesh and whatnot. And so, but now, in my years of study on pandemic, I've seen so many medicines that are rushed to, you know, every single time there's a big pandemic, there's miracle cures, there's we got to get it done. There's always a Fauci every single time. For people who've read Joseph Campbell, A Hero with 1,000 Faces, which I've read all of Campbell's books, about, I don't know, a dozen, I guess. I've read that one 3 times because I'm a writer, right? Hero with 1,000 Faces. When I've read more than 40 books on pandemic, I'm like, you know, all these pandemics are like the same too. It's like pandemic with 1,000 faces. There are certain archetypes. I mean, every time you get a pandemic, that's why in January of 2020, I was telling people, stock up on food, because there always comes famine if you get a severe pandemic. And we did not know how severe this pandemic would be. We had no idea. If this thing had an R naught like measles, if, you know, like 14, in other words, where, you know, one person gets it, he spreads it to 14 others. And if it had a, you know, a case fatality rate that was, you know, 30%, you know what I mean? The United States would be dead right now. It'd be dead. It'd be road warrior stuff, right? And so, you know, you've got to pay attention to these things. We will face a very severe pandemic at some time in the future, and quick reaction to it is vital, right? Very quick. I mean, you don't have like a month to decide. That's why I masked up when the the Taiwanese medical community said on December 31st, 2019, that this was person-to-person airborne. I masked up, right? Because I do pay attention to these things. I just thought it was a good idea. I didn't have any idea of the effects of this thing. And bottom line is, I'm not going to take this vaccine right now. It's still or one of these vaccines. They're still experimental. All the companies are indemnified. Meanwhile, they're still trying to lock people down for political reasons that have nothing to do with the vaccine, the pandemic. The pandemic is real. So to deny that is also crazy, quite frankly. But then they're overreacting to it, or not necessarily overreacting, but using it for reasons that we well know, to rework the economic landscape, to lock down people from traveling, to gain more power. And we see, I'm here in California right now. This is like the Hunter Biden of states of the United States. I mean, this whole state basically comes off as like it's a massive drug addict. I mean, the whole state of I spent more than 2 years in California. I went to school here. I went to a military language here school here called Defense Language Institute, and then later after the Army, I went to school here as well. And so I'm quite familiar with California. I've been all over it: north, south, east, west, Death Valley, up to Yosemite and Redwoods. You know, Los Angeles, San Francisco. Went to school there. You know what I mean? I've seen the state, right? And this is the worst I've ever seen it. And all they're doing in massive cognitive dissonance, I'll call it California dissonance, is they keep doubling down on stupid, right? They keep putting billions of dollars into helping homeless, which is not doing anything. The homeless is just growing. Look at this. Look at this this video that you're putting up right now. This is normal. This is not abnormal. Somebody might go, "Oh, you're cherry picking that." No, you're not. That's all over the place. That's all over the place. It's absolutely normal. It's right outside my window. You know, this garbage everywhere, people defecating on the streets. Yeah, I was up in Beverly Hills, what, 2 or 3 days ago? Woman defecating right on the street, Beverly Hills. Yeah, normal.
Well, look, Mike. I know that there's always controversy on the scientific arena, whether it be the Green New Deal or how we deal with the pandemic. And look, keep in mind, folks, it was a scientist in this nation when we first used the nuclear bomb in Japan, and we used 2 different ones to see which one actually, had most significant kills per kiloton. That scientists sat around in the U.S. said, let's see if we could maybe explode a nuclear bomb in the atmosphere, and maybe we can catch the atmosphere on fire. See if that works. And this actually happened. This was the thinking of the scientists at the time, trying to see if they could maybe light the atmosphere on fire. So when you have individuals who come on and say, well, I'm a certified scientist, and these guys were, that this is what we're looking at specifically as being the future of medicine, or future of climate change, or future of what we want to do for future technologies and AI, keep in mind that there's always a political backing that forces them to kind of look at that. And hopefully in today's discussion, from what we talked about, starting from Burma to where we looked at what information operation does, to our news media, what our politicians are doing, whatever our COVID relief packages are targeting interest in supporting even China's expansion and the region, what the current administration might have been looking at as far as going back to bringing the same Obama transplants back into the administration, looking at possibly agreeing with what initially they had agreed with when Wang Yi stood on stage in 2012 and said that, China and U.S. Interests have to work on China's term, basically, and we never proposed any type of pushback against it. All is tied, and as I tell people that link analysis is something that you have to know is as strategic for you to understand why you're being affected as you are in your particular area of your community. We can only reach out and touch what we can, and guys like you and others and me try to do the best we can through the mediums we have to at least educate the people and let them make the decisions as they go forward. Mike, with that said, I'm going to give you the last word, and if people want to read more about you, where can they go? And give us a last word before we move on.
Right. I publish often on Patreon. Sometimes I'll go on War Room Pandemic, or I've just sent a couple pieces to Epoch Times because they've asked me to write a column for them. So I'm all over the place, actually. Best way might be to put my name in Google Net Alerts, and then you can see whatever pops up when I'm publishing here or there. But I do get around. I will be hitting all 50 states to see what the situation is. I'm going back to Oregon and Washington State soon. Then I'll go back to Texas and some other states. I'm going to go to all 50 states and to take atmospherics and to see. Hopefully, we don't go into a profound civil war. But the reason I'm back in the United States right now instead of Taiwan is because I'm very concerned that we're actually going to go into a kinetic civil war.
I hope it doesn't happen, Mike. When I was on the campaign trail, I kept on saying we need to get more Army guys to run for office, whether it be on the one party or another. I don't care. We got to get our guys in, and I think the only saving grace for this nation would be in the long run as guys like you and me who have served and individuals who are serving today, because eventually we got to come together, we got to agree on the fact that, you know what, we got to save the nation. And let's see what happens. Maybe we'll take the step that our nation initially took, which was the Army was created prior to the nation was. And it was an Army that actually established the United States, and is going to take guys who served in the past and who are serving today to finally say we have to put an end to these foreign powers trying to destroy our nation internally. And hopefully our politicians will figure it out and work with us to allow a much more prosperous United States in the future that actually can, feed its homeless and take care of its Americans that are on the street, as you were saying today. Mike, thanks for coming, buddy. We'll link up again. Hope to see you in DC, and there's a lot of other work we got to do. And don't ever be a stranger. We're going to bring you back again. And with that said, thank you for being here. Guys and gals, this is New Paradigms. God bless you, Mike. We'll see you guys on the battlefield.
On Wednesday,
Bye, Sargis.
the big
Anytime.
events happened at the Capitol building with Antifa leading the way and using agent provocateurs to basically guide Trump supporters into the Capitol building. Those are APs. Go over the wall. They had set up the bike rack barriers that they had taken down and used those for ladders, right? And so you had people, APs, helping people get over the wall, right? So I stopped, got video of their faces, photographed them, clear AP work. Come this way, go up, come on, there's still room, you can get in. Come on, you need to come up, this is your job, this is your chance. Stand up for your country. Waving huge Trump flags, got the rebel flags out there, false flag. That's why they call it false flag. Meanwhile, you've got Trump supporters going, no, there's Antifa here. Antifa start attacking the police. They're like, that's not us. That's Antifa. You can see it on many videos.
At Epoch Times, we have many videos showing Trump supporters stopping actions like that, stopping destruction, and very clearly saying many, many times, we don't do that, don't break those things, so on.
Right. Yeah, the Trump supporters were trying to intervene. You can see when the initial attacks were going on, Trump supporters trying to pull them back. And then back from the front line on some of my other video, I haven't even looked at my own video yet, but people right in front of me talking, saying, I don't agree with this is wrong, we shouldn't be here. There's Antifa all around us. You hear Trump supporters jumping up many times going, there's Antifa here. They're doing this. Antifa are making us look bad. Be careful. They're going to attack us. There's Antifa all over the place. They're dressed just like us. We don't know who they are. But on the tactical level, out there in front of the Capitol, that was the tactical CNN, you might say, was Antifa that day. Leading them right into the action, breaking down doors. You can hear clearly Trump supporters saying, don't break anything, show respect. There must be thousands of videos, so I obviously can't go through them all. But you can clearly see many Trump supporters saying, don't break anything, don't steal anything, that sort of thing. And there you go. I did not go inside the building. I was outside the building watching the activities out there. We saw a lot of agent provocateur activity with Antifa using Hong Kong tactics, using wearing the same sorts of masks that they wore in Hong Kong. As you know, I was in Hong Kong for approximately 7 months until they finally kicked me out. So I was in about 100 protests, and 100 of the big protests and many of the small ones. So I'm very familiar with their tactics, very familiar with their procedures and how they operate. And we know that Antifa was actually in Hong Kong learning their tactics, and the goggles and the same sorts of 3M masks and that sort of thing. Because this requires the kind of analysis that only Epoch is doing at this time, you in particular, because there's probably thousands of videos to digest. But what we've seen so far, and being physically present, Antifa clearly led the attack. That was utterly obvious. For instance, outside during a part of the attack, when there was much gas fired and I believe rubber bullets, I'm not sure about that. They were throwing flashbangs, that's clear, we were right there. There was a lady on a megaphone saying, send up the mask, send up the masks. She said it over and over. It's on our video and others. That's a clear Hong Kong tactic that I've never seen in any other war and conflict, which is Hong Kongers would constantly say, send up water, send up masks, send up shields. We saw shields. That's what they used in Hong Kong. That's what Antifa is constantly using. You see, they show up with their homemade shields often, or shields that they've stolen. And so, yeah, there was Antifa written all over this. What we saw there at the Capitol was right out of the handbook. It was the playbook. And in other words, show up wearing your enemy's clothing, waving their flags, and do things while, basically false flags. That's why they call them false flag. They're bringing and waving the enemy flag, which is Trump supporters' flag. They're waving Trump flags and doing violence. Now, keep in mind, there's different elements of Antifa. There's that element that would occupy the Red House. That's not your A-team. What we saw in the Capitol building is your A-team. That's like your Special Forces Antifa. Those are the guys that come out for special actions. So that's your 1% of Antifa. On the pie chart that I've shown you before, that I drew out for you on paper, that's your tiny sliver. That's your Special Forces of Antifa. That's what we saw in the Capitol building. They know exactly what they're doing. They're well trained. They're well organized. They show up with the gear that they need. They've got the statements ready to say, she's dead, that sort of thing. They come out. They make great statements for the camera. Sound bites. These guys are professionals. They come in and they harness the energy of a pre-existing movement or protest. So in this case, let's say Trump supporters. I believe actual Trump supporters had a real rally. Trump called it himself, so he gave the speech at the Ellipse in the morning. So they basically hijacked your horse, right? So they come in, and in this case, after the speech at the Ellipse, you had to walk, pretty far over to the Capitol. So people were left the Ellipse to go to the next rally of course, went to the Ellipse to hear President Trump speak, right? The next rally was at the Capitol building. So as Trump supporters started to go to the Capitol building, where we went next, that's when I started seeing APs that were like, this way, keep coming forward. ACAB is all cops are bastards. So when you see ACAB, ACAB, written, usually it's magic marker or painted, that's a clear Antifa sign. It couldn't be any clearer. Trump supporters never come up with ACAB. For instance, you never see Trump supporters with shields. And Antifa constantly uses shields. Hong Kongers, of course, use a lot of shields because they were getting hit with rubber bullets.
Now, another thing we saw is individuals changing their clothes on the scene. I understand this is also something, it's very odd behavior. It's something also we've seen with some Antifa members. If you can tell us why they do that, and some of the incidents we saw during the protests on January 6th where people were doing this as well.
Right. They're just harder to track when they change clothes, right? They can egress and ingress as well. They can go to the action in one set of clothes, do their Superman change, and then egress after they change clothes. I didn't go inside the Capitol building. I saw it on other people's video, right? So that's a common Hong Kong tactic, to bring change of clothes in your backpack, or to wear two clothes to begin with and just take one off, right? Now, one thing to always watch for with change of clothes, this is basic spy craft 101, is they rarely change shoes, right? So the shoes will tend to be the same. You don't usually bring two pairs of shoes. You've got a group there. You can harness their energy and use it to your ends. Come this way, everybody, just wearing their, waving their flag. This is where it's at. Come over here. Go to here. We're going into this door, right? It's too easy. And once people get riled up, they'll do it, because we're humans and we will go with the herd and right through that door. I am the most experienced living American combat correspondent. I've been doing this for years in many countries. As you know, Hong Kong, that's where we first met. And so war is what I do, not elections, right? And I know what I'm doing when it comes to war. And I see the United States is now clearly going into civil war. It's unambiguous at this point. And so what we saw there, Antifa is helping to rile this up. CCP is neck deep in this. And so we are facing an information war of unprecedented scope. I've written 3 books on it. Unfortunately, they're all in Japanese, because I've been working to try to wake the Japanese up to this. They're also a target. The Japanese are facing the same information war, but in Japanese language, trying to rewrite textbooks for schools, taking hold of teacher unions. Every technique and tactic that you see being used here is being used in Japan, right? And it's being used to split Korea and Japan. It's being used in Korea as well. As you know, I've spent years in Asia rolling around studying this thing, so it's coming for us now. We have to make a united face to face the enemy. The enemy is CCP and some others who are organic to the United States.